Greetings, welcome to Powered by Yami. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, actually I'm going to jump right into it. You'll figure it out on the way. I am broken. In fact, almost all human beings are broken. We have to be. You may be wondering curiously, well, how is that? Or why is that? And what do I mean by broken? You see, let me start with a story. Then as the story progresses, I will share with you some of the insights from that story that will answer those essential questions. So let's start with pain. You see, pain is not simply discomfort or a feeling or hurt or even trauma. See, pain is the instigator that determines who and what we become in this human world, human experience. You see, pain is much like insulin. You see, insulin is a regulator of the two major sources of fuel for the body. On the one hand, the body can feed off of glucose, that is blood sugar, or it can feed off fats. And insulin is what determines or decides which one to feed off of. And as such, pain is like that insulin. It is a regulator and a governor, of who and what we become. And there's no human being on this planet then, now, and certainly in the future that will have a human experience without any form or sort of pain. Because pain is a necessary and a almost, sort of filled with an epiphany in terms of the nature of pain. When I say epiphany, pain is not only the instigator and the regulator for who and what we become, it also acts as epiphany, a sort of reminder about who we really are and who we're not. Let me give you the story. And this story is about me. Now, I was born, as some of you know, on the island of Jamaica. Blessed to be born there for many reasons. One of which is that I was born into a family of healers. My grandfather was a healer. My mother's mother was a healer. Her mother was a healer, and so on and so forth. And there are people within my grandfather line that also was a healer, right? And so being born into that family, I did not attend church when I was younger in Jamaica. I spent time with my grandfather, whom, as many of you know, I love very dearly. And, he introduced me to this world of rituals and culture and knowledge, deep knowledge, if you will. And so he was a part of this tradition in Jamaica referred to as Kumina or Pokuminya, but really Kumina or Kumina, as they say in Jamaica, which is a Kikongo term, Kumina. And so there is a lot of West Central African origin to the practices, but Kumina is also much like Candomblé in Brazil, or Obia in the English-speaking Caribbean, or even Voodoo, via Haiti and New Orleans and New York. It's really an umbrella term for a series or set of ritual understandings, practices, spiritual understandings, if you will, and practices and rituals that form a sort of cohesive body of knowledge and practice, right? And so my grandfather, being such a healer, I tagged along with him. I loved being around him. In fact, I was fascinated by what he did, and I was bored by what other children did my age. In fact, I found them, terribly boring and uninteresting. I found my grandfather fascinating. Now, this is me at 5, 6, 7 years old. So I saw my grandfather engage in a lot of rituals. In fact, he would do rituals for us being my brother and I at the time. And so that was my world. And that was the sort of understanding that I had. And that understanding also, was purposeful because I was born into, a family, and particularly born through my mother. Because it just so happened to be that my earthly mother is also my mother, spiritual mother as well, back home. And so being born through her and having that grandfather who's her father was setting me up for a particular life, as a healer. But of course, life doesn't necessarily go from point A to point B in a straight line. There are detours, there are zigzags, there are U-turns. Some of us get off the road and can't get back on the road or path. And so growing up in that environment in Jamaica, really taught me a lot. But then trauma happened. There was a fire in our yard. And when Jamaicans say yard, they're referring to their homestead or their compound, if you think about in the African setting. And in this yard, my grandfather lived, my mom lived, of course, we the children, my grandfather's, wife, his children who were my aunts, and others that were there. We shared, several compartments, in this yard, similar to the compound you might find in Ghana or other parts of West Africa. So in this yard, tragedy struck. I was walking back from the road, getting some hard-boiled bread, some kalaloo for my mom, and then I got to the yard. I saw that there was a fire, from the compartment where my mom and I, my brother, and my then infant sister stayed. And the fire was raging, and so by the time I got to maybe about 12 feet from the door, because fire was gushing out the door, I saw my brother, younger brother, he was on fire. His shirt caught on fire, so I grabbed him and I rolled him on the ground. This is a dirt ground, because I knew instinctively that the dirt ground would actually extinguish the fire. Then some of the fire caught on me because, as you can imagine, there's pieces of wood and the light just blasting out of the compartment, out of the room door, and onto the open yard. And so I rolled myself in the dirt, and then once my brother and I were good, I immediately looked towards the door. I began to run to see my mother and baby sister, I think, who was around 11 months old at the time. Short to say, the fire was so hot and so heavy, I couldn't go inside the room. I couldn't see inside the room or the compartment where she was. Come to find out later, my baby sister transitioned. She passed away. And my mother, was scarred. Half of her body was burned, from the fire. And, that night I stayed up all night. Did not sleep. I sat on this tree stump, I watched the fire truck eventually come, maybe 2 hours later. By then it was just, embers and smoke, the fire did its job. And I stayed there on that stump until the morning. And when morning came, I was still there. I don't recall what happened after that. I just remember being in this daze. But what's critical in that moment is this. I think I was 9 or 10 years old. It was in that moment, I remember with clarity, with perfect clarity, that in that moment I decided essentially, what kind of person I was going to be. I had begun the process of essentially, my soul or a part of me leaving this body that you see in front of you, of course, a younger version, leaving it and going back home. And that's what happened. A younger me, 10 years old, had left because the pain was too much. And then a few months later, a few months later, or a year later, I moved with my mom. My mom brought us up to New York City, to Brooklyn, my brother and I. And, a month after we arrived, my grandfather transitioned. And then 6 months later, or 7 months later, my uncle transitioned. He was my favorite uncle. And so, that year and change, was really a turning point in my human life. And that the younger me, 10, 11-year-old me, had left and gone back home. You might wonder, well, how is that possible? Well, I'll explain to you in a moment. Let me finish the story first. So went and gone home, and that left a certain part of me, right? And the part of me that left was the more angry part, was the more embittered part, was the more one that could not understand, why the people I loved the most had left me, right? Had left me behind. And I remember, my first few months in Brooklyn, I had a dream with my grandfather. He came to me. It was like just pure white. And I'm standing there, and he just floats towards me from up, wherever up was. But everything was just pure white. And he came kind of floating towards me with white on. Only his complexion provided a contrast. And then, I looked at him, And of course, at first, I said, it's my grandfather. So, I was excited. But then I hesitated, and he sensed my hesitation because I wasn't sure what to do with him, right? And then he just floated away. And since that point, I had not seen my grandfather for more than 30 years, right? And the experiences were such that when I woke up, I told my mom, I said, I told her the dream, and she said, it's a good thing I didn't go with him, because if I went with him, I would not have waken up. Essentially, the part of my soul that was still in my body, right, would have gone, according to her. Now, I've asked other people, I've told other people, excuse me, about that dream, and they have said that, well, maybe he was trying to show me something. Both are possible. I kind of err on the side of my mom, because it's my grandfather's charge for him to groom me to become a healer like he was. And since my mom decided unilaterally to take us to the United States, to Brooklyn, to be precise, Brooklyn, New York, that is, then, his responsibility, his task was incomplete, and he was called back home. And so, having not accomplished that task, he had no other purpose, because his purpose was to groom me. And so, with that, the trauma had turned me into this person. Now, I was still me, but part of me had, again, that innocent, that delightful, that very cheerful, introspective child, had gone home and left a very, angry not at the world, but angry at the fact of why the people I love the most, left. And so I was just filled with pain, and pain essentially transformed, was what was left of me, into someone that said love didn't matter, because the people I love, they left me. And so I just, yes, I cared, but caring is not love. And so, I didn't love. And in many ways, any, woman or girlfriend or woman that I was with, yes, I cared about them, but I never loved any of them because I couldn't love them. And yes, I cared for them, and I treated them very well, but that's not love. And so I went through much of my adult life, being this person that, didn't or couldn't find love. And then, I've always wanted to change my name, for my birth name. And I did so. First, I asked my mother and my father for permission because, of course, they named me out of respect. I asked them. And then, they gave me their permission. And so I changed my name. And then another part of me left because now I assumed the name of somebody else. But here's the thing that many of us don't realize. In doing so, it wasn't me that simply chose the name, Kwesi Konadu. Yes, I'm Kwesi because I'm born on Sunday, but there's a particular Kwesi Konadu that was out there in the ether, that was out there in the atmosphere, close to the earth. That is a spiritual figure or being. And the backstory for him is that he, had 4 sons, and the 4 sons loved him. But he was, unkind to them, and I'm being very mild. His wife loved him, and he was unkind to her. Not unkind in terms of, violence or brutality, but the violence of not accepting or wanting the love that they offered. And therefore, was sometimes harsh. Well, he was harsh with them, because he could not and did not want to receive love because he, while his lifetime had not, received love. So you see how the cycle begins to play out. And it is that spirit, of course, going to do that's found fertile ground in this body you see in front of you and hopped in. And so, it wasn't necessarily, a particular person that pained me or hurt me. No one has the power to do that. It was essentially, the part of me checking out when I was 10, 11 years old because of the magnitude of pain of losing all the people that I loved and cared about. My younger sister, my grandfather, my uncle, and in many ways my mother, because when that fire happened and she was never the same with that and with the departure of her father, my grandfather, and her brother, my uncle. And so a part of her checked out, went back home, right? And so I left alone. And being alone, I had to face this world by myself. And so I grew up very early, 11 years old in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights. Grew up very early. But even though I was a quote unquote good child, I didn't get into trouble in any of that thing. I didn't cuss, I didn't argue, didn't fight. Defended myself, yes, but didn't fight really. I began to not see any value in love. I thought it was foolishness. In fact, I often joked with my daughters when they were younger that I wasn't a sucker for love. And though it was joke, perhaps to me and maybe to them, and perhaps they were being fooled by it, it wasn't a joke, right? I had essentially, groomed and nurtured the spirit of this entity called Kanadu, that found vulnerability, and took over this body, which means I didn't love anyone, that I was with, and couldn't love them, right? And so, the people that I found, the women that I found, very few of them anyway, they were like me, right? They didn't have love. They couldn't, find love. They didn't value love. They were manipulative. They pretended, because I pretended, to be this person that, that was not the person, because I was broken. And in the broken vessel that was there, the spirit took over because it found essentially a home. And, but over the years, something interesting happened, which is that I wasn't completely gone, meaning, the original me, there was a fight back and forth. And so there are times when, that Kwesi would come out, with his arrogancy and his know-it-all and his coldness, his callousness. And there are times when the, original me would come out, and just sort of back up and say, I apologize, and try to mend and make things. And so, being broken necessarily doesn't mean that you're in pieces. It essentially means that there's a fight within, literally, for your soul. But it's you fighting you, or you fighting one of yous, because as you might realize already, and these are the takeaway points, and I'll continue the story in another episode here on Powered by Nyami. So here are some key takeaways. Pain is what really makes us. It regulates us. It determines us. And pain can be singular or cumulative or serial, meaning it happens over a period of time. And pain is also a process, meaning that it doesn't necessarily, means that one particular act or moment or hurt is going to determine, but you don't know which one will be determinative, right? It could be, a particular kind of sexual advance or abuse or molestation, or seeing someone you love die, or in pain or hurt. It doesn't matter what the hurt is or the pain is, but it comes in so many forms that you can't determine which one will act the most. Because, for example, I have seen some things in my life, dead bodies, I've seen, people, or at least heard next door, people being raped, it's just women being raped, or women being raped, let me be precise. So I've seen a hurt thing, but those things didn't pain me, right? So we don't know what exactly is going to be the particular pain or package of pain, but it will regulate and determine you. And it will send part of you, the goodness part of you, back home, because that's when we find a split. And we will know this, for instance, when a person or persons will say about somebody else that, such and so changed, or, this person, used to be so kind, or used to be this. Now look at them. Well, this person is because, that goodness part of them, whatever trauma or pain happened to them, so that goodness part of them went home, right? It could not bear, because to stay means becoming the very thing that you're leaving. And so it also means that some of us never reunite with the other parts of us, and that can cause some serious consequences, because essentially, the negative spirit or demonic force that takes over your body and the remnants of your soul essentially will eat away and essentially control whatever's left. And so it will then live out, because remember, it can't go home. And so it floats around in the earth looking for bodies to assume, to have out their human experience. And so another implication, of pain breaking us and making us into these vessels for all kinds of hurt and brokenness, and really, torn apart from inside out. This also implies a theory of why the world is filled with the wickedness that it's filled with. Imagine this. Imagine all 7 billion plus people on this planet, and at least half of them, if not more, are broken souls. Imagine why we inherit a world that is filled with warmongering and warfare, that's filled with hurt and pain. Parents hurting children, spouses hurting each other, men hurting women, women hurting men. The list goes on and on and on, right? So this that I'm sharing with you explains, at least to me, makes sense to me. It might make sense to you. Provides a theory or explanation, for why we have the wickedness in the world, why we have the layers of wickedness and evil and just horrible people in this world. Whatever they may be: murderers, rapists, assassins. People for hire, pedophiles, rapists. It doesn't matter, right? The kind or quantity or quality. The earth is filled more with them than with others, because of pain, right? Now, how do we deal with this pain? How do we, reunite, those parts of us that went home with the part that's here to essentially close the loop, and ensures that all of us as one solid package returns home, right? How and when or how do we get our second chances, sometimes third chances, right? I'm on my second chance, and I'll answer those questions, if you will, on the next episode. In short, what I'll say is that, my blessing and second chance came in the form of my wife. My wife, is the one that has taught me and is teaching me how to love and, essentially guiding me. Now, just so happened that she is also a healer, a damn good one, exceptional one, really. And what it also made me realize is that, healers too need healing, right? But how do they get that if they're too preoccupied or consumed with healing and helping others, right? And so that's their conundrum. That said, the question I've laid out to you in terms of what to do, from that point on, if you are broken, and chances are you are, and some of us are more severe than others, but the fact of the brokenness, is still there. So how do we mend those pieces together? How do we bring ourselves back into union? How do we, essentially fight and push out the negative force or demon that has come to occupy the body and pretend, essentially to be us? Those and more we'll tackle on the continuation of this topic. For Pablo Anyami, I've been your guided host. Until next time, stay well. Drop your questions, comments, and experience down below. Until then,